Well, this whole incident of the man born blind in John 9 starts with a theological discussion over probably what should have been a time for compassion. Jesus and the disciples see a man who's been on the side of the road, probably begging, and they discuss his plight in sort of distant theological terms, who sinned, this person, and so on. And so I wanted to look at a film clip from the movie Shadowlands. It's a movie about C.S. Lewis's life and some of the events. I showed this clip at Sunday school, so if you saw Sunday school, if you were here at Sunday school last week, it's the same clip. But it's C.S. Lewis used to give lectures on the radio during World War II. And the whole book of Mere Christianity was actually a series of lectures that he read on the radio during wartime in England. And this is a clip from one of those lectures that he gave in that time of war, only in the movie. This is not C.S. Lewis. I want you to understand that. This is Anthony Hopkins playing C.S. Lewis. All right, so with that introduction, I'll see if I can pull this up here. We should be able to start it right off. Oh, wait a minute. Before I start it, you want to hear it. That's the important thing about this. Hearing it. Hearing it is important. Okay. Now.
Yesterday, I received a letter that refers to an event that took place almost a year ago, December the 4th, 1951. My correspondent hadn't forgotten. I doubt many of us have. That was the night a number 1 bus drove into a column of young Royal Marine cadets in Chatham and killed 24 of them. You remember? And the letter asks some simple but fundamental questions. Where was God on that December night? Why didn't he stop? Isn't God supposed to be good? Isn't he supposed to love us? Does God want us to suffer? What is the answer to that question is yet? So I'm not sure that God particularly wants us to be happy. I think he wants us to be able to love and be loved. He wants us to grow up. I suggest to you that it is because God loves us that he makes us the gift of suffering. Put it another way. Pain is God's megaphone. Rose and death word. You see, we are like blocks of stone out of which the sculptor carves forms of death. Blows on his chisel, which hurt us so much, are what make us perfect. Thank you.
Part of the beauty of C.S. Lewis is that he doesn't ever flinch from heading into the teeth of controversy, which is what I like about him. He says right off, does God want us to suffer? What if the answer to that question is yes? I think, if I understand it correctly, what Jesus is doing in this incident with the man born blind is that he's recasting the idea of suffering and what the purpose of it is. You see, it used to be that the Jews, and they're still, this is in the scripture, okay, so you can't knock it. But the Jews and even many Christians say about suffering, if you're suffering something, then it's probably God punishing you in some way or another. It's probably God making you suffer for the sins that you've committed. And so they see a blind man and they say, who sinned? Was it this man that sinned? Well, he was born blind, so how could he sin even in the womb? Well, that's probably not an option, so it must have been his parents. And of course it says in Deuteronomy that the sins of the fathers are visited onto the children for the 3rd and 4th generation and so on. So they were, every time time that they saw people suffering, they saw sin, God's punishment. And I think that Jesus is trying to take that and turn it on its head, turn it around for us. He says, no, it wasn't that this man sinned. It was that the glory or the works of God might be made manifest in him. It's not sin necessarily. It wasn't even necessarily this man's personal sin. And of course, we all know that he was a sinner like everybody else. But Jesus is cutting the cords that bind the idea that all suffering is caused by some sin in us. It's not. And so Jesus says it wasn't that this man or his parents sinned. It was so that the works of God could be made manifest in him. Now, this blind man had suffered greatly, I'm assuming, in his life. Like everyone else with disabilities, he probably, run into things, little bits of suffering like that, barked his shins against stuff. But he probably sinned, people in those days were less politically correct than we are and didn't necessarily take care of people with disabilities, so he probably was the object of some ridicule. He probably had a lot of pain and suffering in his life because of his blindness. And not only that, but he ended up getting in trouble with the authorities. I took pity on whoever was going to read this because this whole chapter is all this one long story. And Jesus heals the man, and then he gets in trouble with the religious authorities because, well, who is this guy who healed you? And he says, he goes, I don't know who he is. But he's in trouble with the Pharisees, the religious authorities. And he ends up being in such trouble that he's excommunicated. In verses 22 and 34, the indication seems to be that because the blind man ended up saying Jesus was a prophet and didn't sin, that they put him out of the synagogue. They excommunicated him. So he went through a lot of sin and suffering, and yet he ends up blessed. And I think one of the things that tells us is that suffering is to be understood not as punishment, but as God's blessings, like Lewis said there through Anthony Hopkins towards the end of that clip. Suffering is God's blessing for us. He makes us the gift of suffering so that we might come to know him better. The example he uses is that we are like blocks of stone that God is carving, chiseling into a beautiful statue of some kind. And that the blows of the hammer which hurt us so much are what's turning us into that beautiful sculpture. So I think that's one element of this story that's important to see. And it recasts suffering. But I don't want to get stuck there because we're going to be discussing that at the next higher ground. So if you want more thinking and talk and discussion about suffering, come to higher grounds in 2 weeks and we'll really pick that apart. I want to leave that now and just say this, that for Christians especially, suffering is God's blessing to us to help us become more and more like his Son. The second thing I want you to see out of this whole incident with the blind man and becoming able to see because of what Jesus does in his life is this, and that is the importance of telling our faith stories. Now, it's important to be able to witness to what God has done. It's important to know the basics of the gospel. But I think every bit as important, it's important to be able for us to share what God has done in our lives with people who are outside of our lives, people who are outsiders to the church. It's important to do that, and I think that that's what happens to this blind man. Almost, I don't know if you could say against his will, but just because of the situation, he has to tell his story over and over again. In verse 9, it says, his neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." And the word in Greek there, they've done a good job translating it. But because all these people were asking him, it says in Greek that he kept telling them. He kept having to say over and over again to different people, yes, I'm the one, I was blind, and I was sitting there one day, and this guy, Jesus, came by, and he spit in my eyes. I think it's, I don't like to make too much out of that miracle because it almost sounds like, Jesus walks up and makes mud and puts it on his face and says, now go wash off. He never tells him that he's going to see when he does it. He just says, go wash your face. So he goes and he does it, and he sees. And the blind man has to tell this story over and over again. But notice what happens as he's telling the story over and over again. He's growing in his own understanding of who Jesus is. As he reflects on what has happened to him, and as he reflects on the things that Jesus has done in his life, and then tells them, he grows in his understanding. So, in verse 11, which is the first time he mentions it, how were your eyes opened? They demanded of him. And he says, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, and so I did, and then I could see. So the first thing that he says when he retells the story is the man Jesus. Well, yeah, he's not, another creature. He's a human being. So he understands him as the man Jesus. But then later on, notice what happens. In verse 17, after having told the story several times, presumably, and he's brought before the Pharisees, finally they turned to the blind man again and said, what have you to say about him? It was your eyes that he opened. And the man replied, he's a prophet. So you see, and I don't think he's received any instruction. He's just thought. First of all, he was a man. And then he tells the story. He says, well, it can't be just a man. So he says, well, he's a prophet. He's done some great things. He's a prophet. And then in verse 31, he goes on a little bit further in his understanding of Jesus. It says, the man answered, he's again before the Pharisees. They're hurling insults at him, which is an interesting thing. You're this fellow's disciple. We're disciples of Moses. And the man answers, now this is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly man who does his will. So again, he moves beyond just a human being and beyond just a prophet to say he's a godly person. He's not a sinner. Now, when you start saying he's not a sinner, he's a godly man, you're starting to get on some dangerous territory for the Pharisees. But this man is growing in his understanding of who Jesus is as he just tells the story and reflects on it himself. All right, and then he goes on in verse 33. He says, not only is he not a sinner, and not only does he do these great things, but he is from God. If this man, he says in verse 33, were not from God, he could do nothing. And so he comes to see that Jesus is a human being who is a prophet, who is not a sinner, who is from God. And it's at that point that they reply, you were steeped in sin at your birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. And that word threw him out is the technical term for excommunication. They put him out of the synagogue because he had this high view of Jesus. And I want you to notice that apparently he's not receiving any instruction from anybody. He hasn't come into contact with Jesus again. It's just telling other people what God has done for him in his life, that his understanding of who Jesus is grows. Now that should that should say something to us. That should say that one of the ways that we grow spiritually, one of the ways that we come to know God better, is simply by telling others what he's done in our lives. Simply by taking the risk, and this guy has to take some pretty big risks. He ends up being, it was publicly humiliating to be thrown out of church. I mean, if we had to throw, Don or Tom or somebody out of the church publicly, I mean, it would be humiliating. He's taking a risk, I'm saying, the blind man. He's taking a risk, and he's actually experiencing rejection. But in the light of that, his faith and knowledge of who Jesus is growing. So I think that in itself should commend itself highly to us. That if we want to know God more, and if we want to grow in our knowledge, one of the things that we can do is share with others and be willing to experience some of the negative that comes back. And of course, in verse 38, at the end of the story, he ends up acknowledging that Jesus is the Son of Man, the Messiah, and bows down and worships Jesus. And all of that is because he's telling the story and reflecting on it, and meeting with Jesus himself, obviously, there in verse 38. Also, I think it's interesting that he extends an invitation to the Pharisees, who were obviously very hostile and were not followers of Jesus. They make that very clear. He says, do you want to become his disciple as well? He's extending an invitation. I think that this is probably, I don't think that he's being sarcastic here. I think he's probably still trying to figure this whole thing out. He's newly encountered Jesus, and he's saying to the Pharisees, are you going to follow him? Do you want to become his disciples? Now, of course, they make it very clear that no, they are not going to follow Jesus. They're going to follow Moses instead. But nevertheless, this blind man, part of his spiritual growth, is being willing to face rejection, and just in telling people what Jesus has done for him. Notice nobody's converted, at least from what the scriptures say. In this telling and retelling of the story, nobody seems to be brought to the Lord except the blind man himself. But it's a good thing for the blind man to be telling that story. The most beneficial thing that happens when we share our faith with others is that our own faith grows. Our own faith grows. I saw an interesting thing the other day. You know, Mormons send out people to bike seekers. And usually not in weather like this. Christians are the only ones willing to avoid weather like this. Just kidding. They're probably out there somewhere. But Mormons go on a mission assignment. Every Mormon kid that grows up in the church is supposed to go on a mission assignment. They, ride bicycles, wear coats and ties, come up to your house, like to talk. And they asked a Mormon bishop one time about the usefulness of that. And he says, really, honestly, not many people are converted to Mormonism this way. But, he said, few people who go on a mission trip ever drop out of the church. Now, I think that says something about why they continue to do that. And I think it speaks really highly of people being willing to take the risk and share what God has done in your life with somebody else. I think that may be the biggest thing that we do. And so consequently, one of the things that I'd like to ask people to consider doing is maybe writing down the story of how God has worked in your life. St. Augustine, who lived 300-400 years after Christ, and probably after the Apostle Paul, is like the most famous church father who thought about the faith and has shaped the faith in the way it is, wrote a book of confessions, and the confessions basically were him praying his life story back to God. And so he wrote down all that God had done for him as a prayer back to God of thanksgiving. And so it might be interesting for us to write down, just as an exercise, of the high points and the low points of where God has worked with you in your life. And having that in your mind so that you can tell others about how God has dealt with you, how God encountered you, what God has done with you to help you to grow as the person that you are, so that you can share that with other people. It would be good for you to write it down, but it's also be good to have it in mind. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about, because as I mentioned before, in the Gospel of John is an amazing piece of work in that, I forget who it was, Origen or one of the early church fathers said that the Gospel of John is theologically shallow enough for a child to wade in, but deep enough for an elephant to swim in. I mean, there's so much in all of these stories that it's like impossible to get through them all. But I think it's always good to say, or to ask the question out of all of this, what does this tell us about Jesus? Because we saw last week that, during the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus goes up there and says, if anybody's thirsty, let him come to me and drink. And he does that while they're pouring the water on the altar, so that the river of life will begin to flow from the altar, as the promise came in Ezekiel 47. So that reveals something about Jesus. And this incident takes place, presumably, still during the Feast of Tabernacles. He says in verse 12, or in verse 5, I want to read verse 5 to you. They're having this discussion, the disciples, who sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And that's a replay of John chapter 8, verse 12, where he's still in the tabernacle, still in the temple, not the tabernacle, still in the temple during the Feast of Tabernacles. And Jesus speaks again to the people and says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And we see Jesus giving sight to a blind man and continuing to say that I am the light of the world. While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. At the Feast of Tabernacles, we talked last week about how they brought the water from the pool of Siloam up, poured it onto the altar, and so on. There was also part of that week-long feast, 8 days of feast. They had every night these giant, really, really, really big candelabra that were oil lamps. And I'm not sure if they were a menorah, like how we have them, but they were big, big, big lamps that they put all around the temple, and they lit them at night. And it was said that you could see Jerusalem from I forget how far away, because the lights were so bright from these candelabra. They were all around the temple. And then during the night, the priests and the Pharisees and the rabbis and people who were considered to be the holy men of God would dance in the light from these candelabra at night during the Feast of Tabernacles. Because the Feast of Tabernacles was a huge celebration. And we went all through that last week about Thanksgiving for the harvest and remembering God's leading them through the wilderness and so on. It was a huge celebration of thanksgiving to God. And so all these people would be dancing in the light that came from these candelabra to illumine Jerusalem and illumine the lives of the people. And again, you have Jesus on an occasion like this saying, I'm the light of the world. Taking the focus off of the ceremony that was going on. Last week, the water being poured and the remembrance of what God has done and putting it on himself. If anybody's thirsty, let him come to me and drink. And today, he reminds them again, when all this light ceremony is going on, I am the light of the world. Now, again, you have to try to put yourself as a person there, standing, probably you've been to your 4th or 5th or 10th or 20th Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem. They say, yeah, let's go up, and when they light the candles, let's go up and watch the holy guys dance. The rabbis, Rabbi so-and-so doesn't have a very good sense of rhythm, does he? Oh, no, stand around. We're doing all this stuff. And thanks be to God. They're singing psalms and they're dancing and thanking God for light, because God is our light and our salvation. And so they're thanking God for light and everything like this. And they're all focused on being good celebrants of the Feast of Tabernacles. And then here's Jesus saying, I'm the light of the world. And it would be like, what? What? It would take your attention and focus off of what was happening in the temple and rivet it on Jesus. That's exactly what he did last week. And in fact, all through the Gospel of John, these signs that Jesus does are all about riveting our focus on him, for better or for worse, because when the focus goes on you, sometimes it's not good in the case of the Pharisees. The Pharisees became his implacable enemies. Nobody can say that. It's blasphemy. Get rid of it. But what it does is that it shows you the amazing chutzpah of Jesus. I said that last week, and I say it again. Jesus is making claims and putting himself into the middle of the center of what God is doing in a way that what C.S. Lewis says has to be true. Either it means he's a liar and he's trying to deceive people, or he's crazy and he actually believes this stuff himself, but he's a lunatic. Or he's the Lord. He's telling the truth as it is. And those are basically the three choices that we have. He doesn't leave it open to us by the way, Jesus doesn't leave it open to us by the way that he acts and talks and teaches, just to say, wow, what an amazing teacher. That's not an option. He was an amazing teacher, but he was way more than that. So much more than that, that to call him just an amazing teacher does not do justice to who he was. And my contention is that he was the Lord. He is the Lord. Right now, he's the Lord. And he meets his people whenever we gather together, whether it's here or Bethlehem or Sunfire or Pemberville, it doesn't matter where, wherever his people gather, hear his word, and partake of the sacrament, there he's calling people to himself as we come in faith. And so I would invite you today to come in faith, to allow yourself to be drawn by the presence of the risen Christ who meets here with his people.